Bwong. Holy crap.
Hey guys, our third and final Dark Lord villain for Villain Month is the Dark Lord Sauron of the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth. In this video, we'll be going over his story and his capabilities.
Okay, so first a small Tolkienian informational note. Delving into Tolkien lore, you'll find that almost everything is very interconnected and name-heavy. We're going to try and simplify things in that regard as much as possible. Otherwise, we'd have to stop every few seconds and explain what that place is, or why that artifact mattered, or who that person is and why that's super important, etc., etc., etc. So we're going to try and streamline that a bit for you guys by skipping exact names of people, places, or things unless that information is important.
Next, a wee bit of background information. Sauron was the second and last Dark Lord to menace Tolkien's Middle-earth. This is important primarily because explaining the first Dark Lord will set the foundation for understanding who and what Sauron himself was. Okay, so the first Dark Lord of Middle-earth was a god known as Melkor, or Morgoth, depending upon when in his timeline you're talking about. Now, if you're paying attention, you may have noticed I just said he was a god. That's not a euphemism or an exaggeration. In Tolkien myth, existence was created by a singular deific entity who had a plethora of names, but who we are going to call Eru. One of the first things this overgod did was to create a plethora of deities second in power and influence only to himself. These were called the Ainur, which were divided into the Valar and the Maiar. For simplification, the Valar were greater deities and the Maiar were lesser deities. Many of the Maiar in fact served or were otherwise attached to the various Valar. This is important because of the 15 Valar-level entities, one, Melkor, was a raging, arrogant jackhole. Though only Eru, the big god, could create life, the Valar could shape pre-existing life, as well as harness, manipulate, or control anything else. Chiefest among the Valar in this and other areas were Manwë, the king of the gods, and Melkor, he who would take Eru's throne. It should also be noted that of all the individual Valar, Melkor was the single strongest, effectively making him the second most powerful being in all of creation. He was also the source of all evil, so that's nice.
Long story short, Melkor goes on a rampage once everyone touches down on the planet where Middle-earth resides. He was the big bad during the First Age, back when everything was still being made. Elves were born, and magic was all the rage, etc. During all this, his mightiest ally and lieutenant was none other than Sauron himself. Sauron was a Maiar, one of the lesser deities, and was originally a pure, good-hearted being in service to the god of smithing and workmanship. This will be important later. But one of Melkor's best tricks was the seduction and corruption of, well, anything and everything, a skill which Sauron would later inherit. So he did just that with Sauron, and over the course of thousands of years that make up the First Age, Sauron, originally the greatest of the smithing deities Maiar, became the greatest agent in Melkor's service as well. He was both cunning and powerful. In fact, as time went on, once Melkor established a base of operations for his forces, he left Sauron in charge of his fortress, and even left Sauron to manage the wars Melkor was raging against the elves, so that Melkor himself could have more time to focus on corrupting all of humanity for his own use. Sauron had wild success in this regard, until he relocated himself to an island he'd conquered and got on the wrong side of a string of good guys. While managing wars, capturing spies and the like, Sauron's fortress was besieged. If besieged is a term that can properly be used when talking about two creatures, a powerful elf woman and a wolf that had been magicked up by the gods had come to Sauron's home, both to take it back, as it was originally an elven stronghold, and to rescue some of Sauron's prisoners. The magic wolf had a neat piece of mysticism about him, in that, among other things, it was said that he could only be killed by the greatest wolf who ever lived. Be nice, guys, the Silmarillion is called the Legendarium for a reason. So, when this elf and wolf duo came knocking on Sauron's door, he sent scads of wolves to fight them, including the very first werewolf, an exceptionally powerful being Melkor had left in Sauron's service. This didn't work, and eventually Sauron, who as a Maiar had numerous powers, including shapeshifting, descended on the intruders in the form of a mighty and terrible wolf. His mere presence was enough to cause the elf problems, and she was useless in the fight. But Sauron and the wolf fought a titanic struggle. A struggle which Sauron ultimately lost. Apparently a god in the shape of a wolf didn't count as the mightiest wolf ever to live. Go figure.
This is where we learn an important fact about the Maiar. As lesser deities, they are kind of mortal, but only kind of. Left to the god-touched wolf's mercy, Sauron is offered a choice: let his mortal shell die and lose the fortress anyway, or keep his body and run away with his tail tucked between his legs. Sauron opted for the latter, but what we learn here is this. A Maiar is immortal, in the sense that its spirit, its soul, is nearly indestructible, but the body, while powerful, can be destroyed. Now, should a Maiar's body be destroyed, they have two options. Slowly rebuild one over time, as Sauron does later, or seek help from the Valar they serve and have the greater god rebuild their body for them. It was believed by both Sauron and his adversaries that Melkor would not take kindly to Sauron's defeat, which is why he kept his body and fled. He would then spend the rest of the First Age lying low, presumably in hiding or exile from Melkor, who was eventually defeated and locked out of the world, which would be a long story involving a whole bunch of greater gods, and as such is not a story that we're going to get into here.
After Melkor's defeat, Sauron pled forgiveness and mercy for his evil deeds in Melkor's service, a plea which was granted, but it was demanded that he return to the Land of the Gods, a different continent across the sea west of Middle-earth, to face judgment for his crimes. Sauron decided that that plan sucked, and instead hid quietly for several centuries in Middle-earth before emerging once more during the Second Age. Once he was sufficiently certain that none of the other Maiar or Valar were going to come around and interfere with his plans, Sauron decided it was time to be the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, and he planned to learn from his previous master's failings. Rather than do battle with powerful gods and elves while relying solely on his own twisted creations or men, as Melkor had been the first creator of such creatures as orcs and werewolves, Sauron spent time quietly building his forces, before putting his plans for world domination into motion. Our titular Dark Lord knew that men were easily corruptible and usable, but of the more powerful creatures that existed in this world, the elves were the most numerous of those that remained, and so he wanted to dominate them in order to assure his reign. To do so, Sauron returned to the public stage under the guise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, and approached many of the various elf lords before being accepted by Celebrimbor, Lord of Eregion, and a lover of crafts. Because what Anatar was selling, or more appropriately, literally giving away, was the knowledge of how to forge rings of power, magical artifacts that would grant their wielders fantastic mystical might beyond what they normally were capable of. As a side note, if the name Celebrimbor sounds familiar, it's probably because he was one of the main characters from the Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor games. Yes, he did in fact exist in Tolkien myth. So if you want to know more about the details of his story, click the card in the upper right to watch the video we did on him a while back.
While most of the other elf lords didn't trust Anatar, though they didn't realize he was Sauron in disguise, Celebrimbor took all that Sauron had to teach him and created 19 rings of power, 9 of which would be gifted to the kings of men, 7 given to the dwarven kings, and 3 given to elven lords. Sauron was patient, and as such, having laid the groundwork for his plans in the form of the gifted rings of power, he waited several years before creating the One Ring. The One Ring was a ring of power that was designed specifically to grant its bearer, Sauron himself, control and dominion over those who wore the other rings of power. Thus, if his plan had gone off without a hitch, he would have, with the creation of the One Ring, gained control of the rulers of most of Middle-earth in one fell swoop. However, his plan hit several snags almost immediately. First, from the very moment he donned the One Ring, the elven lords in possession of the Rings of Power sensed his presence and his treachery. They immediately took off the rings and wouldn't dare to wear them again until Sauron had been perceived to be vanquished. Sauron, in response, demanded the return of all the Rings of Power, as their creation would not have been possible without him. Remember, he was once a mighty servant of the god of smithing. He was collectively refused and went to war over it. He was also thwarted in his attempts to subvert and corrupt the dwarves through the Rings of Power, as, ironically, they, the dwarves, had been created by the very smithing god whose service Sauron had left, and said god had made the dwarves with full knowledge of Melkor's corrupting influence, and consequently designed them to be nigh on immune to such effects.
Despite the fact that, at one point during the War the Ring making started, Sauron controlled nearly all of Middle-earth, this conflict would end in many kingdoms being devastated, including Sauron's. Though he came out of the whole thing looking the best, indeed, even after harsh defeats he continued taking more territory in the aftermath of the war with the help of his most powerful servants, the Nazgul, the 9 nearly immortal ring-wraiths, all that remained of the 9 once mighty kings of men. The only twisted success stories from his entire ring-making debacle. But his initial victories were not to last, as, at some point during all of this, Sauron drew the ire of the Numenorians, a long-lived race of men more powerful than most of their brethren, from off Middle-earth's coast. With his forces in their weakened state, Sauron knew he couldn't match the Numenorians' might, and when they demanded that he return to their ruler and kneel, he feigned a reluctance and distaste, but ultimately acquiesced to his foe's demands. While there, Sauron pulled a full Palpatine, once again assuming a fair and pleasing form, and in the space of only a few years, rose from hated prisoner to trusted advisor to the Numenorian king, instituting a worship of his old master Melkor throughout the realm, complete with human sacrifices, before eventually convincing the Numenorians to launch a full-scale assault on the realm of the gods. This event marked one of only a handful of times that Eru, the overgod who created everyone else, intervened directly in the events of Middle-earth, as 99% of the time he let the mortals or the Valar and Maiar handle things themselves, with only some minor direction here and there on his part. However, as the Maiar Sauron had instigated a full-on assault on the home of the Valar using mortal men as puppets, Eru himself stepped in, drowning nearly all of the Numenorians by sinking the island, flooding and killing all but those still faithful to the Valar, and destroying Sauron's corporeal body in the process. Sauron's soul would then slink back to Mordor to rebuild a body for himself, and the surviving Numenorians would establish two kingdoms on the mainland, one that Sauron would later destroy, and another that would become Gondor.
Sauron would spend his time while rebuilding himself, rebuilding his forces as well. But this marked the first major defeat and loss he suffered in our reckoning, as, whether as a result of having to rebuild the body on his own, the Wrath of Eru, or something else entirely, Sauron would never again be able to take a pleasing form after the fall of Numenor, and, no longer able to use his guile and deception to his advantage, he began to reign with terror, brute force, and power. He eventually attacked Gondor, seeking vengeance on those he now considered his most hated living enemies. This war eventually resulted in the infamous Last Alliance of Elves and Men, forcing their way into Mordor and laying siege to Sauron's fortress. This siege lasted for 7 years, before Sauron, once again bearing a physical form, took to the field of battle, slaying the kings of both elves and men in combat, each considered among the mightiest of their race, before Isildur, Prince of Gondor, cut Sauron's ring finger from his hand, severing the connection between Sauron and his ring. This banished Sauron's corporeal form, as, to make the One Ring capable of a feat so mighty as to be able to control the other rings of power, he had had to pour a substantial amount of his own soul into the ring. Basically, more of his soul was in the ring than not in the ring. As such, when the One Ring was separated from Sauron's grasp, he was separated from most of his power, and his body ceased to be. The rest of Sauron's story, most viewers probably know. It would take several thousand years, but eventually, during the Third Age, Sauron was able to pull his energies together enough to once again begin directing his forces. He set up shop under the guise of a necromancer in Mirkwood to get some work done before being driven out and back to Mordor, but by then he'd accomplished what he needed to. He spent the rest of his time after that prepping his armies for world domination and sending his Nazgul out in search of his ring, as even though he'd again made a body for himself, he possessed only fractional amounts of his power, since most of it resided in the ring. Ultimately, he would be tricked into thinking Aragorn, the new king of Gondor, possessed his ring. Sauron could only feel the ring's presence when it was being worn, and would send his forces to retrieve it, clearing the way, as was the plan, for his ring to be delivered back to the fires from whence it was created by two unassuming hobbits and Gollum. When the One Ring was destroyed, Sauron's power, held in the ring, was destroyed as well, and his soul was struck an irrevocable blow. As a Maiar, he wasn't dead. His soul couldn't ever truly be destroyed. But, because he'd poured so much of his soul into something that could be unmade, he had been rendered so powerless that he would never be a threat to Middle-earth again.
Despite arguably being defeated more times than either of our other two Dark Lords for the Villain Month, Sauron kept coming back, and he is truly a force to be reckoned with. As a Maiar, he is, plain and simple, a lesser god. And no matter how you slice it, a lesser god is a major power player in nearly any scenario. Like our other two villains, his powers are also largely nebulous. You may notice that's something of a running theme with the big bad evil overlord types. But like everyone else, we do have some hard information on the guy. He's immortal in the truest sense of anyone discussed so far. He has an indestructible soul, and so long as that soul remains, even if it takes him literally millennia to do so, he can pull a body back together and get back at things again. Or, at least that would be the case if he had never made the ring. So now, as long as the One Ring exists, so does he. The One Ring is simultaneously one of his greatest accomplishments and his greatest weakness. By putting his immortal essence into a finite object, he actually created a weakness for himself. And hindsight being 2020, since the plan he created for the ring didn't work out so well, it wasn't the best trade-off. Since, contrary to popular belief, and in fact our original belief, as far as our research had turned up, the ring doesn't give Sauron much of a power boost in anything other than domination, which, while useful, doesn't help him in a straight fight, like we're looking to put him in. He is also a master craftsman. He used to have the power to shapeshift and has access to all kinds of magics. The wizards seen in the books and movies are actually less powerful and possibly intentionally hobbled Maiar themselves, specifically sent by the Valar to oppose Sauron. So literally anything Gandalf, Radagast, or Saruman pull in the books and faithfully adapted in the movies would be something Sauron was capable of doing as well, and on a more powerful scale. This also goes for the powers of his Nazgul, and likely most magical niftiness we see elves like Galadriel pull as well. He commands legions, and he's excellent at manipulation, and especially while holding his ring, very gifted in twisting the minds of those within his sphere of influence. He's far from invulnerable, however. While presumably highly durable and physically powerful, his body is still quite susceptible to death. He was broken and drowned in the flooding of Numenor. His finger, and thus logically the rest of him, was able to be cut by a normal blade wielded by a mere mortal. And if his foe is similarly nigh unkillable, he can be physically overpowered, as seen with the wolf. Plus, during the final stages of his life, and arguably the height of his power, if the One Ring can be destroyed, he's out of the fight.
And that's basically Sauron, Dark Lord of Middle-earth, lesser god, and a being that very literally shaped the course of history for 2 full ages of Middle-earth, each age made of thousands of years apiece. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave us a like, and if you'd like to see something specific, be it a topic of lore or the subject of a Let's Play, let us know in the comments down below. And if you'd like to see more videos from us in the future, be they lore or Let's Play, go ahead and hit that subscribe button.
In the meantime, y'all, this has been 2 Men and a Mic, signing off. Hey guys, you can click the link in the left for our last lore video.
You can click the link on the right for our last Let's Play.
And right here in the middle, that orb, you can hit that to subscribe.
Also, ring the bell if you want to be notified when we post a new video.
This is 2 Men and a Mic. Thanks for watching.